And hopefully the slides have displayed properly for everyone. So thanks for the quick little introduction. I recognise quite a few names and faces on the call already, and I have presented to the diff on previous occasions. So hopefully we don't require too much information or background in terms of the type of work that we've been doing. But I just wanted to contextualise where we are and where we've effectively ended up, because this is going to be the very last of the major customer insights pieces of work that we'll be doing as part of Project Edge. So over the last few years, we've really been looking at the experience of customers and of potential customers. We've done some work looking at the views and perspectives of potential residential customers, what they think about DER, what they think about the joining of VPPs and their attitudes and their perceptions associated with that. We've interviewed potential C&I customers to understand what they're looking for with respect to the adoption of DER and joining VPPs. And we've also done a series of interviews with residential customers of the 3 Project Edge aggregators, really with a view of trying to unpick their experiences with both the adoption of DER, but in particular, what their experiences were about the VPP more broadly, what worked well, and what were some potential opportunities for improvement. The piece of work that I'll be talking to in this session is focused around, again, those residential customers of the 3 Project Edge aggregators. And rather than interviewing them, this time we're actually doing, and we'll be talking to the results of a survey that we did with this particular cohort. What we're particularly interested in trying to understand is, again, their experiences, but in particular, what can we do to build up the trust that potential customers or current customers have in terms of VPPs? What do we need to do to make sure that when customers and aggregators are developing up partnerships and longer term relationships from a customer service provider perspective, how do we make sure that it is as relational as possible, as opposed to something which is a more transactional result or a transactional relationship, because they tend not to give rise to the mutually beneficial outcomes we'd be hoping to emerge through VPPs more broadly. Are we certain that customers are satisfied with the financial rewards that they are receiving for their VPP participation to date? And how do we effectively communicate with VPP customers more broadly? So these are some of the things that I'll be talking to in the presentation to come, but also a range of other insights that we've been able to glean as a result of the survey that we've undertaken. So just a very quick overview of who we were able to capture and the time period as well. We effectively had about a 30% response rate for the survey that we emailed out to customers of the 3 Project Edge aggregators, resulting in 63 current VPP customers. Now, all of these customers had been on the aggregator, with the aggregator, for at least a month or two. So they'd all had experience with the VPP aggregation process. They had had experience interacting with the VPP, or at least experiencing the VPP more broadly. So they're not necessarily people that have just signed up yesterday and then are completing the survey today. Data collection also took place in April 2023. So very fresh data. It's sometimes a situation where there can be a large temporal lag between when you actually collect the data and when you've actually been able to undertake all the analysis. But in terms of what we've got here, very fresh in terms of when we were able to collect the data. So I'm going to talk through, first of all, the profile of customers, and obviously acknowledging that this is just the experience of 3 aggregators, but it provides a bit of a picture as to the types of customers that might be especially interested in VPPs, at least in the first instance. Presumably, as we start to move beyond the early adopter cohort and we start getting out to broader swathes of the population, this customer profile will shift and change over time. But certainly at the moment, it provides some interesting insights for who might be especially interested in joining an aggregation type service. So we can see here that customers tended to be older than the Australian population average. When we're looking at the customer base for the 3 aggregators, or for the people who completed the survey, we had more than 50% of that population being aged 60 or above. And we can see that that compares with approximately a quarter of this population would sit in that particular age range. So we're certainly looking at an older population base relative to the broader Australian community. We can also see that the people who had completed the survey were far more likely to have completed postgraduate qualifications. And if we combine both the postgrad and the undergrad, we've got a very educated sample relative to the Australian broader population. And this certainly aligns with some of the other work that we've done looking at prospective customers. Those who are interested in the adoption of DER tend to also be those that are more likely to have completed a university education. So certainly seen some triangulation of those results with what we're finding here relative to some of the other pieces of work that we've actually produced as well as part of Project Edge. In terms of some of the household dynamics that we were looking at, we saw that there were significantly or substantially more households who were completing the survey who had dual occupancy status. And that's perhaps reflective of the age range that we had. These are potentially families whose kids have moved out of the house, and so it's just them and their partner. And that probably speaks to the broader age-based dynamic that we're looking at. But certainly if we were to look at how the values compare, 52% of the surveyed customers were in dual occupancy households versus 34% of the Australian population. And whereas a quarter of Australians live by themselves, that was only a basis for about 10% of the population, 10% of the customers that we were surveying. We also looked at the income distribution, and by and large, this didn't substantially differ from that of the broader Australian population, noting though that we've got about a quarter of our customers who preferred not to provide that level of information. So into the results broadly, what did we find and were customers satisfied? And I think the broad headline result is that yes, customers were satisfied, but ... And I'll talk to and unpack that in a few moments' time. But let's first of all look at the satisfaction that we were able to identify, or the satisfaction levels that we were able to identify as a result of the survey responses. You can see up here on the screen that we've got satisfaction levels not only for the DER, but also for the VPP, because it's important to really try to disambiguate those two elements, because the person might be really satisfied with their DER asset and less satisfied with their aggregator experience, or vice versa. Hence why we've looked at both of these things in two different ways. And what we can certainly see is that 79% of customers were broadly satisfied with their VPP experience, 30% being strongly satisfied and 49% being reasonably satisfied. And I think that, broadly speaking, that's a really positive outcome to have identified, especially given the fact that this is part of a broader field trial, especially given the fact that we're dealing with a brand new technology or relatively new technology. They are satisfaction levels that I think are very positive to have actually seen. Now, the broader challenge with trying to understand customer satisfaction is that there are lots of different ways of looking at whether customers are satisfied or not, and each of them have got their own potential weaknesses and strengths. So what we did is look not only at the extent to which customers reported their satisfaction with their DER and VPP, but also for a couple of other different metrics, really to provide a broader, more complete picture of their satisfaction. This one relates to the Net Promoter Score, or the NPS, and some of you might be familiar with it, some of you might not be, so I'll just quickly spend a couple of moments unpacking exactly what NPS is all about. Effectively for NPS, what customers are asked to do is to rate the extent to which they would feel comfortable positively communicating about a particular product or service to friends or family on a scale ranging from 0 all the way through to 10. And responses of 9 or 10 on that scale get classified as promoters, 7s or 8s get classified as passives, and detractors are those who rated 0 through to 6. And then the net promoter score is calculated by looking at the proportion who were promoters relative to the proportion who were detractors, and more specifically, subtracting detractors from promoters. And what this ultimately tells you is the number of people who were in aggregate likely to either be more promoting or more detracting for the piece of technology or service or product that we're looking at. So what we can see here is that the NPS for DER was 45. So in other words, there was 45% more customers who were prepared to promote as opposed to detract that technology, which is a very strong score. The score for the VPPs was also strong. It was an NPS score of 30. And I've put up here on the screen a couple of comparison NPS scores just to give a sense of how they're tracking relative to a couple of other Australian studies that have recently been completed. The first was for an average of 7 VPPs, and so there would obviously be variation within those broader conglomeration of VPPs, but broadly speaking, the average NPS for those Australian VPPs was 11. And then we've also got a value for the Simply Energy VPPX, which had an NPS of 65. So I think both at a relative level, but also from an absolute level, it also speaks to the fact that the population that were involved with this particular trial were broadly supportive and happy with the extent to which they had those interactions, both with the DER, but especially important from the VPP perspective. We also asked customers to rate their likelihood of remaining with the VPP. Obviously, if you have strong intentions and desires to remain with the VPP, it typically means that you're relatively comfortable and satisfied with it. And we can see here that almost 2/3 of customers were rating in the top 3 of those relative likelihood of remaining with VPP scale, varying between 8, 9, or 10. And so again, this broadly speaks to the fact that an overwhelming proportion of customers were broadly satisfied with the VPP experience that they had received. So all things considered and looking at those 3 metrics, we can see that VPP satisfaction was broad. But you'll see up in the title that I've also got but fragile, and I think that this is important to also unpack. The first is that relatively few customers were able to identify whether their VPP was competitive relative to other VPPs. We can actually see that about 2/3 of customers were not able to effectively answer this question. They were putting neither agree nor disagree as their response. And I think there's a few different reasons to explain why this is the case. The first is that there aren't necessarily a huge number of other competing VPPs that are available within the marketplace, and that obviously is going to have an impact for the extent to which you can determine whether your VP is competitive relative to others. And the second is that there aren't necessarily the publicly available metrics that can help customers better appreciate how their VPP stacks up to those of others. And so I think broadly speaking, this is often consistent with what you'd be expecting for relatively new forms of technologies or services. People aren't necessarily always in a position to be able to compare how their VPP stacks up with those of others. That being said, I think it's also important to take this result and to cross-reference it with those broader satisfaction values that I was talking to. People were, on the whole, supportive of and satisfied with the experience that they had had, but as more VPPs start to come into the market, as people become better able to evaluate how their VPP performance stacks up with those of friends or family, then we might start to see a more competitive landscape that starts to emerge, and that in turn could have implications for satisfaction moving broad. Hence why I think that this is sort of very much speaking to the nascent sort of feature of this market, and where it might move in the future may not necessarily be exactly what we're seeing at the moment. The second, I suppose, caveat that I think is incredibly useful for us to keep in the front of our minds is the level of comfort that customers were reporting with having an aggregator actively managing their DER. At the end of the day, and if we really abstract out, this is a foundational part of a VPP. Without having active management of a DER, VPPs can't operate. And so the fact that we've only got about 59% of our customer base who were either very or extremely comfortable with having that active management of their DER asset, I think speaks to the fact that there's more work that needs to be done, really with a view of trying to increase those levels of comfort, because we're dealing here, and I'll talk to this in a few slides' time, with perhaps also a slightly different customer cohort relative to what might be the case moving forward. And what they're prepared to do and what they're prepared to sign up to may not always be consistent with that of others moving forward as well. So I think that this is really speaking to the fact that more work needs to be done, really to have that assurance for customers that they can indeed trust an aggregator to actively manage their DER, and that they won't be worse off as a result of having an aggregator actively working with and managing their DER. The second broad insight that really wanted to draw attention to through this presentation is about the value proposition. And I think that there are both some really positive things here, but also some elements that are going to require some pretty significant amounts of work to really try to develop up value propositions that will resonate with broad segments of the population. I think that if you're looking to try and take or to develop up a value proposition for small segments, that's one thing. If you're trying to develop up value propositions that resonate for broader segments of the Australian community, that's another thing. And it's that second element where I think more work will still need to be done. But in terms of the results, if we were to look at the reported satisfaction with the financial rewards that they had received for participating in the VPP, 71% of customers were indicating that they were either somewhat or very satisfied with those financial rewards, which I think is a really strong number. Where it becomes a little bit more complicated, though, is once we start to cross-reference that against those who were reporting either an increase, a decrease, no effect, or not sure what effect their VPP participation had on their energy bills. And this is where it becomes a more complex picture. So there are a couple of things that, as broader background context, are useful to appreciate before I unpack the results in a little bit more detail. The first is the nature of the financial rewards that were being provided by aggregators to customers. And there was a degree of diversity in terms of what those financial rewards were. For some, it was effectively whatever would be generated through the trading process. Others were providing, or another aggregator was providing a voucher, and another aggregator was providing effectively subsidized purchasing of the DER asset. And so there's a huge amount of variation in terms of what those financial rewards were. And we don't have, unfortunately, the ability to be able to delve down to an aggregator by aggregator basis just by virtue of the numbers that we've got. But broadly speaking, I think there is important to appreciate that the financial rewards that people were receiving weren't necessarily things that were directly linked to their energy bills, that there would often be two different sources of information that were coming through. And I think that might partly explain why we've got about 30% of our customer base saying that they weren't too sure what impact the financial rewards or their VPP participation more broadly had on their energy bills. The other element here, though, to also appreciate is that we've got a relatively unique customer base, at least to some extent. Through some of the qualitative interviews that we did with customers from the same three aggregators, we had a sizable proportion of those customers really talking to the fact that their participation in the Project Edge field trial was effectively generated or came about because they were wanting to further the development of a new technology, a technology that they saw as being really critical and important to assuring Australia's climate change aspirations and to be able to improve energy resilience within their community. And if that's their mindset and they were looking to participate in this trial, particularly with a view of furthering the development of these technologies, any financial reward that they would actually receive would potentially be seen as a lovely unexpected windfall, which might also help to explain both the satisfaction levels that we saw in the previous slide, but also why there was a disconnect between having satisfaction with those financial rewards, as well as also not necessarily seeing all of that come through to a reduction in their energy bills. And so I think that there's some further work that needs to be done to unpack this as we start to have additional aggregators starting to come about in terms of what those financial sort of thresholds are that customers are looking at. We've certainly got that data for prospective customers, and I've presented through this forum in the past about what they're sort of looking at a desired level for the financial returns. But it really speaks to the fact that I think there's additional work that needs to be done, not only in helping to better articulate what those financial rewards are to customers, but also to help them appreciate what that means for their bills, what that means for, at the end of the day, just being able to be able to afford their energy that they need to have to run their household appliances. We also asked customers to identify the extent to which they versus the aggregator or they versus the community were benefiting from their VPP participation. We've got the results up here on the screen, and I'll unpack it in a little bit of detail just to explain what it is before talking to some of the potential implications. So on the left-hand side, we can see that about 60% of customers believed that the aggregator in the household were benefiting about equally as a result of their VPP participation. So relatively even sharing of benefits emerging from their participation. We've got 11% who are saying that the household was benefiting more, and we've got 29% who are saying that the aggregator benefits more. And broadly speaking, if we're looking to try and find a way of encouraging more people to adopt VPPs and to ideally drive the adoption as quickly as possible, as we're starting to try to build out the resilience for the NEM, it's really important that we try to get that blue part of the graph growing as much as possible and to have that yellow part of the graph shrinking as much as possible. I don't think anyone necessarily wants to be signing up to a service where they think the service provider is getting more out of their involvement relative to they themselves as a household. And I think that that's going to be an important part of really building out the value proposition. This is a consequence of the value proposition. And so what needs to be done to actually really start to shift that balance so that households are seeing that they are truly benefiting from their VPP participation. Because the more that we have households perceiving that they're benefiting more, the faster I think that we'll actually start to get VPP adoption. In terms of that grey component on the graph, which is the aggregator and the household benefiting equally, I think people are accepting of that, and that's never going to be criticized. But again, if we're wanting to really try to accelerate adoption, it's trying to get as many customers fitting into that blue part of the graph where they are seeing that their household is tangibly benefiting far more than what the company is in terms of their VPP participation. We also then ask customers to make a distinction between the DER and the VPP components of their broader experience, and to identify the extent to which they were delivering benefits for the household, for the community, and for the environment. And I've just realized that my little, my indicator down the bottom as to what the graph is all about has obscured a certain important part of the graph, but effectively you can see that the two left-hand components here on the graph, these are talking about the household experience. The two middle ones are about the community, and the two right-hand ones are about the environment. And what we can see here from the graph is that customers were seeing that their DER adoption had delivered pretty substantial benefits for the household. We've got almost 2/3 of customers, 61%, strongly agreeing that their DER adoption had delivered really tangible benefits for the household. If you look at that dark green component for the VPP, we've only got about a quarter of participants, a quarter of customers who are saying that joining the VPP had delivered tangible benefits for their household. And again, this speaks to the fact that more work potentially needs to be done to really strengthen that value proposition and to communicate it so that customers can better appreciate what VPP participation means for their household and to get that sense that the household is really benefiting from it. We can see also from the right-hand side, in terms of where it looks for the environment, that 57% of customers were strongly agreeing that their DER participation had delivered benefits for the environment. 44% were strongly agreeing that the VPP had delivered benefits for the environment. And so we've got, I suppose, the environmental consequences or outcomes as being seen as a secondary but still important feature of both their DER adoption and their VPP adoption. Some of the smallest proportions were actually around community. And I think that that's an interesting piece that will need to be unpacked further, both from a community messaging point of view, but also to understand the extent to which customers are really driven by the community outcomes. There are going to be some that do, but still on the basis of some of the existing work that we've done, it's particularly the financial benefits and the energy resilience for the household that are really driving interest. And that's probably going to speak to the things that will most resonate with customers from a perspective of trying to enhance the value proposition for joining a VPP. We can see here just also the significant differences. So exactly the same data, but looking to see the extent to which they significantly differ. And the thing that probably is of greatest interest from the value proposition is the one here on the left-hand side, where the benefits for DER adoption were significantly greater than the perceived benefits for the household as a result of the VPP participation. We also started to unpack customers' expectations and perceptions of the communication that they received as a result of being involved with the VPP. And this graph here only relates to the proportion of customers who record seeing a message from the VPP that they were involved with. We had, of those customers, about half reported being satisfied, either somewhat satisfied or very satisfied as a result of those messages. And so what we did is we also followed up with them with some open-ended questions to get a better sense of what it was that would have increased their satisfaction with the communication that they had actually received. And there are some really interesting and dominant themes that were starting to come through. Broadly speaking, what customers were looking for could be boiled down to 3 buckets of suggestions. The first was having a greater sense of the real-time impact of the VPP activity. They wanted to know not only when their DER assets were being used, but also why. I think that the when part is speaking to the fact that we had, and this is sort of cross-referencing it against some of the qualitative work that we've done with this broader cohort, we had customers who were talking about walking past their DER asset or looking at the apps and trying to infer from the information that they were seeing on the basis of that information, whether their DER was being actively managed, and jumping to all sorts of conclusions because it wasn't always clear when their DER was being actively managed. And that speaks, I think, particularly to the when component. To the why component, we had some customers, and these typically were those that were fairly data literate or energy literate, who were questioning why certain activities were happening when they did, and starting to think, well, why did this happen? Wouldn't it have been more efficient to do X, Y, and Z? Now, that's going to be a subset of customers. Not all of them are going to be as data informed or energy informed as to be wanting to have that higher order explanation. But I think it really speaks to a desire for customers, especially when it's their own DER assets being actively managed, a really strong desire for them to know the ways in which those assets have been used. It doesn't have to be super granular, but just to give them confidence that their DER asset utilization is being done in ways that they can at least have some degree of sense of what's happening and why. Some customers also spoke of wanting to have forewarning of VPP activity to the extent that that was possible. And obviously that isn't always going to be possible. If there's going to be a particular short-term need for it, there isn't the ability to provide customers with forewarning. But customers were speaking of wanting to be able to plan their appliance use to the best of their ability around anticipated VPP activity. And so any forewarning that could be done to really give them a sense that, yes, it's fine to put in your dishwasher, or hang on a second, it might be better to hold off on using your washing machine because an export is going to be taking place in the immediate future. Customers were really speaking to wanting to have further information to be able to plan those household appliance uses accordingly. We also had a number of customers who were wanting to have further information about the trial learnings emerging from Project Edge. And I think that this really speaks to the fact that the customers who were involved with Project Edge were often doing so particularly as a way of trying to help with the support of a technology that they saw as being really useful. This is sort of mirroring that broader explanation I had a few moments ago, that this customer base that we've got may not necessarily be exactly the same as customers moving forward, because they were seeing themselves as helping to pioneer a new form of technology. Now, it's really interesting to note that these same suggestions were also given in a different part of the survey for ways in which customers could have greater confidence in the aggregator actively managing their DER. And I think that it speaks to the fact that if we can be as transparent as possible to customers and to be actively communicating with them about when their DER assets are being used, how and why, that in turn can also provide them with far greater assurance that their DER assets are being used appropriately, and can really help to drive that broader comfort in the aggregator actively managing their assets. We also started to look at some of the different strategies that might be applied by aggregators, particularly with a view of trying to motivate additional export activity. And the nice thing is that we found not only financial strategies that would resonate potentially with customers, but also non-financial strategies, or strategies that may not necessarily have a direct, immediate, upfront financial impact for the aggregators. So the strategies that we were looking at were providing customers with better financial returns, providing customers with free DER maintenance. And so that might be going out and cleaning solar panels, or doing checks to make sure that everything is operating as effectively as possible. to be able to provide customers with an ability to virtually access stored power from other locations. And the example that we had was if you have an EV and you're on the road and you're needing to charge up your EV to effectively be able to draw down on some virtual balance that you may have been able to export back to the grid, to have greater control over exporting, and also to have a short-term philanthropically focused request to export power in the event of an emergency. And across all of those different strategies, we found every single one was identified as being either very or extremely motivating by almost half of customers. So 47% was the lowest in terms of the endorsement of those strategies for things that would be either very or extremely motivating. But as you can see from the graph that I've got up here on the screen, there was one strategy that was hands and foot above everything else in terms of the endorsement, and that was that very last one, the short-term request to help in an emergency. And you can see here on the screen what it looks like from an aggregated perspective. This particular philanthropically focused request was rated as being very or extremely motivating by 84% of customers, and was seen as being significantly more motivating than two of the others that we were actually assessing, which was more control over exporting and accessing stored power from other locations. And so I think it really speaks to the fact that perhaps partly because of the potential motivations for the customers that were involved, but I think also because of some of the climatic issues that have started to emerge in regional and rural communities around Australia over recent years, that there's a real desire, if people are able to feed into the grid to be able to support at-risk or affected vulnerable communities, that there is a desire to do so, provided that it is a short-term request and not necessarily forever and a day, and not necessarily that you're being bombarded with requests either, but that people would feel comfortable being able to potentially respond to those types of requests. And this is something that we certainly also elicited through the interviews that we were conducting with customers as well. And so there's, again, nice triangulation between the findings that we found here versus some of the interviews that we've done previously and reported previously as well. So in terms of the service experience more broadly, there were some really positive signs that were starting to come through. We found that virtually every single customer that we surveyed was satisfied with the ease of installing either DER or of joining the VPP. They were seeing it, broadly speaking, as being a relatively straightforward, relatively seamless approach. We can see 100% of customers were either agreeing or strongly agreeing for the DER installation process, and 98% in terms of the joining of the VPP. We found, however, that only 27% of customers strongly agreed that the VPP was easy to use. And at one level, this might seem like a relatively good result. The fact that, just quickly doing the maths in my head, that we've got 70% of customers who were agreeing or strongly agreeing that their VPP was easy to use. But it's important to appreciate that for virtually all of the customers that we were surveying, whether by choice or by default, there wasn't actually the ability for them to make changes to their aggregator or to the VPP settings. There was one aggregator where choice was available. For the other two, it was by default that there wasn't that ability to make the changes. And so irrespective of all of those different ins and outs, whether by default, whether by choice, the fact that only 27% strongly agreed that the VPP was easy to use, despite the fact that they didn't have to do anything, is, I think, an interesting feature here, and suggests that more work potentially needs to be done, really to help customers better understand what VPP, what it means for them, and also to decrease that perceived barrier of understanding what it is and how to actually use it. I think that that's going to be important moving forward, especially as we start to try to broaden out the user base for VPPs. We also had a look at the broader service experience around a range of different dimensions. So, for example, the extent to which customers perceived that the aggregator knew what they were doing, was reliable and trustworthy, looked after their longer term needs, were easy to contact, made me feel comfortable, and quickly addressed any issues that emerged. And the one that is the real pause for note is around looked after long-term needs, with only 57% of customers either agreeing or strongly agreeing that the aggregator was looking after their longer-term needs. Again, I think that this speaks to the broader work that still needs to be done about developing up a really tangible, really compelling value proposition for customers, and one where customers are seeing that they are going to have their longer-term needs looked after by the aggregator as a result of being involved with the VPP. We can see that from a significant difference perspective, there was a significant difference on that particular dimension, looked after long-term needs, relative to the perception that customers were reliable and trustworthy. And it's an interesting sort of disjunction between those two. Normally, you would see a company that was rated as being reliable and trustworthy would also be seen as helping to look after a customer's longer-term needs. But I think that this speaks to the fact that customers were seeing that they were reliable and trustworthy in the short term, in terms of running an aggregation service, of having the technical capability, the technical know-how, but that's a little bit different to having companies that are in there to look after you and your longer term needs moving forward. So that was a very quick overview of some of the headline results that we have captured from the survey. Just wanted to do a couple of call outs for some things that will be happening over the coming weeks. The first is that we'll be conducting a customer insights public webinar where we will be packaging up all of the pieces of work that we've done. I've presented to this forum and to others over the last probably year or so, and there's been a whole lot of data drops, and it can be really hard for myself, having done the research. I can only imagine what it must be like for some of you on the other end of the call to actually piece it all together, to actually understand what is it that we've learned and what is it that we need to actually have a broader sense around to help the sector develop up compelling VPPs that are going to be attractive to the broader Australian population. So that's going to be the focus of that public webinar, really pulling together everything and providing that broader narrative to link together all of those different key insights and some of the broader emergent themes that I think are going to be really important for the sector to have it in their crosshairs as they move forward. The second call out is that two of the publications that I've presented through in this forum will be available up on the AEMO knowledge sharing website over the next few weeks. The first one is the qualitative insights. I've explicitly called that out a couple of times in the presentation and have presented upon it previously, but that's going to be shortly uploaded to the site, as well as also the survey results that I spoke to for the duration of this session. As always, if you have any queries, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via email. I've got my email address up on the screen, but also happy to answer any questions. And if there have been any in the chat, apologies that I haven't been able to answer those, but I'll look at the chat now, but also very happy if people have got using the hands up function. And Megan, I see that you've got your hands up. So if you're happy to kick us off, that would be great.
And Joshua, thanks for that presentation. It's always really interesting, and you do present information very clearly. My interest is more around the comparison that you gave between customers' perception of value between VPP and DER. I'm interested in how customers were asked that question. So were they asked that question in comparison to one another? So you have DER that allows you to participate in VPP, and what do you think about the value of both of them? Or were they asked to consider what they thought the value was of their DER, and then separately asked to provide you with what they thought about value of VPP, and then that insight that you've drawn is from the comparison of that data? And I ask that question because DER in itself will provide the greatest benefit through to customers. So I'm kind of not surprised that that's reflected, because it's true. And I don't think, like, I'm just interested that it doesn't lead to a wrong insight that you need to convince customers that there's more value in VPP than there is DER, because that's not it. It's about ensuring that they get, you know, the maximum value out of their DER, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. The way that we asked the question was the second of those. So it was effectively an absolute as opposed to a relative question. We asked them, Yeah, what was the value for your household? For DER, what was the value for your household as a result of the VPP? We didn't do that relative sort of question in terms of the way that we posted to customers. I think, and also to your broader point, yes, the value for DER is always going to be much greater than VPPs. I think the challenge is going to be how do we frame up for customers a compelling value proposition for signing up to a VPP over and above signing up to or adopting DER. And I think that that's the challenge that will need to be done moving forward, because people who have received sometimes brilliant beneficial outcomes for their household in terms of energy bill reductions through DER adoption, to then sort of go that next step forward to potentially sign up to a VPP. That's an interesting part that I think from a communication perspective or elsewhere, more work needs to be done to really help customers appreciate the value, but also appreciate the value for VPP adoption won't be the same as what it would have been for DER adoption.
Just to follow up quickly as well, though, in your presentation, I found this really interesting, and I'm talking in, rounded figures, but about 70% of customers said they liked VPP. Only 3% said that they aren't comfortable with VPP management at all, yet only 40% saw financial reward. Yet if I go back to one of your early presentations, the number one motivator for joining VPP was direct financial incentive. So this is all really good news, is what I hear in that, in terms of you don't actually need to provide the value, you just need to provide the perception of value. I'm sure that's not it, but do you know what I mean? Like, it is
Totally.
There's only upside. If people are still saying, hey, we didn't mind it and we thought it was okay, and only 40% are seeing value, interesting.
Very interesting. And I think that the key to trying to reconcile those different sort of results, the first would be for prospective customers. They haven't had that hands-on experience. And so what they're going to be looking for is going to be potentially different to active customers who have had that experience and the exposure with batteries. But also, I have a sneaking suspicion, certainly coming through from the qualitative insights that we've done, that the cohort who have been associated with the Project Edge trials are not going to be consistent with the broader Australian population by virtue of wanting to be pioneers of this technology. They'll sort of seen this as being a fantastic opportunity to really support the development of a new technology that is going to be foundational for a whole range of positive outcomes. And I think as a result, financial considerations may not have been as front and center for them as what it might have been for the broader population. But hopefully, we can still get people coming onto these systems without necessarily being able to deliver the same degree of financial return that DER adoption has been able to historically provide. I think it's just going to be calibrating the threshold where customers will start to see this as being attractive to sign up to over and above having DER, given that that's where so much of the value is coming from. So a slightly waffly way of sort of saying, yes, completely agree, fascinating to see how it does vary across the different pieces of work that we've done.
Yeah, and the bit I'd add to that, Megan, I think you're referring to the second report that had the different customer innovation adopter categories, where we looked across the NEM at recognizing we have a lot of early adopter types, and what would it take to reach a critical mass of early majority type customers. And you're right, the customers we have sort of weighed some of the non-financial things a bit higher than other categories, and once you got kind of along that innovation spectrum, yeah, financial became more, I think, important. So it's, yeah, good to know that there's a promise there. But I think the other things we've talked about in this forum as well is, being able to generate enough value for aggregators so they can have that sustainable business model as well to build out those products.
I'm just looking through the, oh, sorry, we've got another person with their hands up. Yvette, happy to answer your, yep.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for that. That was actually really clear for me, and I'm pretty new in this space. I haven't introduced myself yet, but I am sort of replacing Andrea Morris from the AER in this forum. But just wondering, so rookie questions here. Do we know roughly how many VPP participants there are in Australia, just to get a sense of what that sample size of 63 people is?
Yeah, so it was 63 of the the customers who were associated with the Project Edge aggregators. And it's been a slightly movable number because there were more customers that came onto the trial after we conducted the survey, or because we were looking for people that had a degree of experience. So the 63 with, I think it was about 30% response rate, the total number will be a little bit larger. But Nick, I might flick across to you for a question without notice as to the total number of Project Edge customers who were involved.
Project Edge customers there's just a bit over 320 customers in total. I couldn't tell you how many customers there are signed up to VPPs across the NEM, but I'd love to know. But yeah, in our trial we had 320 or a little bit over.
Okay. It's fascinating surveys and research, and it'll be interesting to know. A couple of years back, I was working in the South Australian state government, and they obviously did that big project where Tesla signed up. I think they've done 4,000 SA Housing Trust homes. So the customers by default became VPP customers. So I know it's a whole different cohort and motivation and a whole different thing, but I think it would be fascinating to sort of unpack that a little bit and understand their experience a bit more. And so I don't know if anyone's familiar with that project or, yeah. That's more of a comment than a question, sorry.
Yeah, but no, I'd agree that it's a very different set of customer issues if you are not necessarily having the same degree of choice, but would be fascinating to do some sort of broader cross-comparison perspectives, because I think that there's going to be presumably a whole range of different models of VPPs that hit the marketplace over the coming years, and understanding the challenges and the perceptions for each of them, I think, is really important.
Thank you.
I'm looking through the chat, and I think, Megan, I've answered most of the questions that you had there, although please come back if I have. Perfect. Craig, in terms of yours for the bill impacts, we did ask a question both for how long customers had their VPP and their DER, and also whether they had installed their DER as a result of their Project Edge participation, or whether they were coming with their own DER. But we didn't have a huge amount of specificity for what the financials were. We weren't sort of getting them to pull out their energy bills. It was just a broader subjective experience for whether there was a slight or substantial increase or decrease, whether they weren't able to tell, or whether there hadn't been any sort of net change to their energy bills as a result of DER and VPP adoption. I hope that answers your question, but happy to clarify or follow up for anything. Cool. I think that's most of the questions, but if there's any others, very happy to answer. We've still got, I think, 8 minutes in the session, but otherwise, if not, I'll hand back to Nick.